Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm Dan Glickman, the director of the Institute of Politics. We want to welcome you all here, and on behalf of the Harvard Republican Club, are you here? Okay. And the Harvard College Democrats? The Kennedy School Republican Caucus? All right, okay.
I think this is Cambridge.
And the Kennedy School's Democratic Caucus? They're okay. Okay. I promise you we'll be fair at this thing. We want to welcome you all to the forum. If it weren't for the war on terror and the Iraq war right now, our national debate on taxes would be on the front page, I think, of every newspaper in America and a lead broadcast of every network news program. But no question about it, since 9/11, the world has dramatically changed. But one key principle has not changed. We do need money to pay for the services our government provides. And as usual, hardly anybody can agree on how much to tax or how much to spend. To some, taxes are what we pay for a civil society, and to others, taxes are the bane of our existence. Taxes and what we choose to spend our tax revenue on define our priorities as a government, a nation, and a people, and also determines what our investment strategy is as a country. This great debate has been going on since our nation was founded and has continued up until today. And the debate has picked up considerable steam over the past several years. As a member of Congress, I remember how President Reagan's tax cuts defined his domestic agenda and dominated American political discourse for a decade. In the 90s, as a cabinet member, I witnessed how President Clinton's deficit reduction plan defined his domestic agenda and I believe changed the way the public viewed Democrats and their stewardship of government spending. President Bush now enters the fray, proposing to cut taxes, while at the same time committing significant amount of resources for the war on Iraq, the war on terrorism, and homeland security. So once again, we have a partisan and a fierce debate on Capitol Hill. Tonight, we will try to clarify the second most important issue facing our economy, the Bush tax cut, and whether it is sound and effective investment in fiscal policy or voodoo economics. To set up the conversation, I'm going to play a brief excerpt from President Bush's State of the Union message, and then I'm going to introduce two of our country's most prominent economic policy leaders and ask them each to make a 10-minute opening statement on the topic. I'll then ask each a brief follow-up question, open the floor up to questions, and then offer each participant an opportunity to make a 2-minute closing statement. So now we will hear a brief excerpt from his State of the Union to hear how the President argues for his tax cut proposals. And I think just to get a sense of the politics, please take a look at the dynamics of who is standing and clapping and who is sitting and frowning. Let's show the clip.
Jobs are created when the economy grows. The economy grows when Americans have more money to spend and invest, and the best and fairest way to make sure Americans have that money is not to tax it away in the first place. This tax relief is for everyone who pays income taxes, and it will help our economy immediately. 92 million Americans will keep this year an average of almost $1,100 more of their own money. A family of four with an income of $40,000 would see their federal income taxes fall from $1,178 to $45 per year. Our plan will improve the bottom line for more than 23 million small businesses. You, the Congress, have already passed all these reductions and promised them for future years. If this tax relief is good for Americans 3 or 5 or 7 years from now, it is even better for Americans today. We should also strengthen the economy by treating investors equally in our tax laws. It's fair to tax a company's profits. It is not fair to again tax the shareholder on the same profits. To boost investor confidence and to help the nearly 10 million seniors who receive dividend income, I ask you to end the unfair double taxation of dividends. Lower taxes and greater investment will help this economy expand. More jobs mean more taxpayers and higher revenues to our government. The best way to address the deficit and move toward a balanced budget is to encourage economic growth and to show some spending discipline in Washington, D.C.
Okay, well, I
give up.
You are sufficiently persuaded? Okay, anyway. Anyway, joining me tonight on my right is a gentleman who served as the chair of the President Bush's Council of Economic Advisors from 2001 to 2003. During the Bush campaign for president, he served as a senior advisor for economic policy, and he has been here in the forum beforehand during the campaign for a debate with the Gore team for the Charlie Rose Show. Currently, he is the Russell L. Carson Professor of Economics and Finance and co-director of the Entrepreneurship Program at Columbia University. He also serves as the Senior Vice Dean of the Graduate School of Business at Columbia, and we're proud to say he obtained his PhD in economics from Harvard University in 1983. And it appears from his CV he couldn't stay away from Cambridge, so it must be the warm weather here, I'm going to guess. He is a former visiting professor at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, as well as the Business School. He is a disciple of the legendary Martin Feldstein and has been described as probably the most influential chairman ever of the White House Council of Economic Advisors and is one of the key architects of the Bush tax cut proposal. So let's give a warm welcome to Professor Glenn Hubbard.
Thank you.
On my left is a gentleman that served in another White House, the one I happen to be associated with. He was the National Economic Advisor to President Clinton and was director of the National Economic Council from 1996 to 2000. He currently is serving on the Council on Foreign Relations as a senior fellow for economic policy and the director of the Center for Universal Education, although he is speaking in his own capacity tonight. A native of Ann Arbor, Michigan, he graduated from the University of Minnesota. For the life of me, I can't understand why somebody from Ann Arbor would go to the University of Minnesota, but that's another debate.
You know whose football team I still root for?
He obtained his law degree from Yale, where he was editor of the Law Review and attended the Wharton Business School. He is a disciple of the legendary Larry Summers. It is said that he logged more hours in the Clinton White House and the Clinton campaign than any other human being, and is considered by most to have been the president's most valuable White House advisor. Please join me in welcoming Gene Sperling. So we will begin, Professor Hubbard, with you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. You know, the nation is at war, and I know that there is a tendency in economic policy discussion to put everything on the war, inasmuch as so much of American security policy and foreign policy rides on the war. So it's said that the resolution of the war is the only thing holding back the American economy. I don't share that view. I think there are a number of downside risks facing our economy. To see those risks, I think we have to go back to the very atypical business cycle that we have experienced, in which we had a much greater role of wealth destruction through the decline in equity prices and very sharp declines in business investment than we have had in any recession in the post-war period. On top of that, the terrible events of September 11th and corporate accounting scandals. When one talks with business leaders around the country, despite what one hears sometimes from business economists, there is a very large sense of risk aversion. I think virtually no business leader takes very seriously the notion that the economy is likely to grow at its potential, certainly this year. Now, that's one lens for looking at the economy, but there's another lens that's very important in thinking about public policy, and that's the lens of the long term. While everything I mentioned to you about downside risks is, of course, there, and of course so are the many geopolitical risks in the current environment, it's also, I think, important to step back and imagine if we were here 2 years ago when I was last at the forum, and I could tell you that I was clairvoyant, and I could see the recession coming, I could see 9/11, I could see corporate accounting scandals, I could see geopolitical risks. I would suspect that most of you, whether you're economists or not, would have raced for the exits with fears for our economy. The economy, of course, did much better than many people thought. The why of that has to do with the great flexibility of the American economy. Now, these two lenses, the short term and the long term, were very much the lenses through which the president was looking in thinking of an economic policy package. What could we do in public policy to both help the short-term downside risks, but didn't diminish and hopefully would enhance the long-term flexibility of the economy? You know, the president put out the jobs and growth package that the clip referred to. Three basic elements of that. One doesn't get the headlines at all, maybe we can come back to it, is a revolutionary change in employment policy, so-called personal reemployment accounts that would very much put people back to work more quickly. The second piece the president referred to in the clip was accelerating marginal tax rate cuts that the Congress had already enacted. Such a policy would definitely help shore up consumer spending. Most controversial, of course, is the president's proposal to do what most economists have argued for many, many years, since before I entered the profession certainly, which would be to eliminate the double taxation of corporate income. Taken together, those proposals would add about a percentage point to GDP growth if enacted in 2003 and 2004, about the size of the downside risks the president's economic advisors had warned him of. If you think about the economics of the president's proposal, I think it's probably most useful to focus on the elimination of the double tax, because that's the most controversial. First, of course, this is a reduction in the cost of capital for investment, and a very large one. It would be the equivalent of enacting an investment tax credit of between 4% and 7%. That's very, very large stimulus to business investment, which is where the headwind is. It would take away a lot of the game playing in corporate accounting scandals. As most of you probably know, most of the accounting scandals that we have seen drew their very breath from the tax code, in particular from the tax code's distinction between debt and equity finance and between dividends and retained earnings. The president's proposals would lead to a fairly dramatic improvement in corporate governance. I think the proposals would also lead to a modest increase in stock prices. I think the CNBC crowd is far more optimistic on that than I am, but I would say that something in the 5% to 8% range seems perfectly reasonable to me. So designed to help the short term, certainly consistent with the long term. The concerns, I think, that have been raised, I'll just tee up two because they're obvious and we can talk about them more later if you like. One is, since the nation is at war, as I led off with, is this the time for a tax cut? I think the better question is this the time for the set of economic policies that we think will restore the recovery and maintain economic growth? Let's be clear, our ability as a nation to wage war, to finance social programs, to do anything we want to do depends ultimately on the size of our economy. Another major issue that was teed up somewhat in the president's clip has to do with the issue of fairness. Is it fair that even if this tax cut were an item of very significant economic policy advantage for the country, is it fair given that its distributional benefits might go to more affluent taxpayers? For those of you, most of you who are probably in economics or taking economics courses, you know that there is very little relationship between who writes a check to the IRS and who bears the burden of a tax. The burden of the double tax is borne by labor in the long run. If you tax something, you get less of it. If you double tax something, you get a lot less of it. What's the it? The it is capital formation that leads to higher productivity in all of our wages in the future. Let me close by going back to where I began. Economic policy isn't made in a vacuum. It is not compartmentalized into short-term and long-term. Public policy, I don't believe, President doesn't believe, can fine-tune the economy. We do have a situation in the world economy in which policy activism is important. In doing so, you want to do something that actually is addressed at the problem and helps the long term, and I believe the President has done exactly that.
Thank you. Mr. Sperling.
Thank you. I have a PowerPoint presentation, which may be a big mistake, particularly after Glenn was so brief. So if I'm going to apologize in advance, I've got lots of quotes on these that are going to come up, and I'm going to move through them quicker than you're going to read some of them, but I have to do that to stay within my time. Now, the first thing I want to say is where we don't disagree. I don't disagree that temporary and moderate deficits in a time of war or recession can be good economic policy. I don't agree that we shouldn't be doing contractionary policies or tax increases that impact the economy at the time that there is this kind of economic weakness. And I agree that growth and capital formation and long-term productivity is the ultimate goal, not ultimate fiscal targets. So where do we disagree? 5 areas. But let me just tell one thing at the beginning, because I think it describes it all. You know, you see one spouse say to the other, I think we ought to buy $1 million house in the Hamptons, and I think we shouldn't work for 4 months in the year. Wouldn't that be great? And the other says, well, but how much does that cost? Can we afford to not work? And the spouse says, no, just focus on whether or not it would be a good thing to have $1 million house and not work for 4 months. But that's not the way life works. But that is very much the way this administration has functioned when it comes to tax cuts. They don't ask anymore, what are the costs? There is never a cost. There's never a discussion that we used to hear all the time in Washington. How are you going to pay for it? How is it going to be revenue neutral? Now, there's been a very big case, and Glenn has been an advocate in that case, that deficits are not as important. The question is often asked, you know, does growth create surpluses, or do surpluses create growth? Well, the answer is that you want strong fiscal policies that will lead to where growth leads to surpluses, and surpluses help support higher capital formation and growth. Next slide. Look at what happened in the 90s. National savings, the bottom line, went from 3.4 to 5.9. Why? Why did national savings improve? Look at private savings. They were cut in half. The entire reason that national savings improved in the 90s, the entire reason was the turn in fiscal policy. It was the sole reason for our increase in national savings. Take a hypothetical year, year 2000. When we came into office, there was supposed to be a $455 billion deficit. Instead, there ended up being a $236 billion surplus. That's a $691 billion swing. That means there were $691 billion that the government was not borrowing, that was therefore available for homeowners and the private capital. Of course, that gave us a greater capital pool, lower interest rates. Next. I'm sorry, it wasn't on the screen. This is just the Goldman Sachs just looked at what the swing from $290 billion in 92 to the swing in 1999 was, and estimated that it lowered interest rates by 200 basis points. 200 basis points. That will save you $3,000 on your mortgage on a moderate home. Can make a huge difference for the hurdle rate for investors. Next slide, please. These are some of the things I'll go through quick, but that's just to show the degree of validation out there that the deficit reduction did play a fundamental role in the virtuous cycle of the 1990s. And I'm always asked this question of almost in a mocked way, you don't think surpluses create growth. But on the next slide, you'll see a very nice statement from Chairman Greenspan in July of 2002 about how policymakers should recognize the important role that fiscal policy can play in being conducive to growth, and, quote, talking about the 90s, the lower federal deficits and, for a time, the realization of surpluses contributed significantly to improved national savings and thereby put downward pressure on interest rates and led to greater investment. So, yes, greater surpluses, to the degree they reflect higher savings, greater capital formation, can reflect growth. Now, on the evidence issue, there's been a recent Peter Orszag and Bill Gale put out a study showing that 17 analyses that looked at the expectation of deficits absolutely found that there was a strong link between deficits and interest rates. Now, I have a slide, and Glenn, I show this everywhere. It's not just for you. I say it's the tale of 3 Republican CEAs. And then I put up quotes by Glenn that suggest that he does not think the link is as strong. And then I go to the next slide, which shows that the previous councils of economic advisors from Republican administration had language that many of you would now associate with so-called Rubinomics, that under Marty Feldstein and Michael Boskin, their CAs very much suggested very clearly and persuasively that deficits did affect interest rates. And my next slide, which I'll go by quickly, is just piling on more quotes. Now, what Glenn would say is, but I said, and he says it sometimes, moderate deficits don't affect interest rates. So I want to question, are these really deficits are only moderate, and are they only short term? So let me be a little partisan here. The fact that current deficits are moderate is because of Bill Clinton's Save Social Security surplus policy. If not, there was a $646 billion swing in 2003. Without the surpluses that were left, without an explicit policy of saving surpluses, look at the next chart, you would see that instead of this moderate, so-called moderate deficit, it had Bill Clinton left a $175 billion deficit, moderate deficit, we would have been at an $800 billion deficit. In other words, this is a case for why it's important to save for a rainy day, not an argument for why it's never important to save for a rainy day. Look at, is it just short term? Next slide. Look at the deficit in 2008. Now, this is 7 years after 2001 recession, 9/11. What do you have there? You have a slide out of order. No, you have $710 billion surplus projected, $153 billion surplus deficit now, an $863 billion swing, and this is CBO's estimate assuming that everything goes right, that they get their tax cut, that the economic numbers happen, that there's no cost to war. Look at the impact on the debt in 2008. When we came into office, when President Bush came into office, there was supposed to be virtually no debt in 2008. Now, $5 trillion are projected. Next slide. Look at what the projected surplus was for a 10-year period. Look at the 2004 to 2013. It was supposed to be $6.8 trillion. Now it's $1.8 trillion deficit. That's an $8.6 trillion swing. These are not moderate, and these assume the optimistic projections that there are no AMT fixes, no cost of war, discretionary growth stays down, and the next slide shows a recent thing from Goldman Sachs where they projected with more realistic assessments that it would be $4 trillion deficit over this 10-year period. So let's go back to our slide again and say that if that 1.8 trillion is really more like 4 trillion, then you're talking about a virtual $10 trillion swing in our fiscal situation. So and the question of is this moderate and short term, I'm going to update Senator Everett Dirksen and say, 8 to 11 trillion here and there, and soon you're talking about real money. Now, then the response comes, the tax cuts themselves are moderate. Are they moderate? So What I first want to go to is a very important economic issue, which is M&Ms. M&Ms are 55 calories per package, and in the Clinton White House, 55 pieces, 240 calories per package. In the Clinton White House, there were M&Ms everywhere, bowls of M&Ms everywhere. And I calculated that if I just took 10 M&Ms at a time, I could never gain weight because it was only 44 calories. This was Sperling logic. As the next incremental handful of M&Ms will never make a difference in your weight, eating M&Ms can never make you gain weight. The result? Pretty painful diets, Stairmaster, new clothes. Bush economic logic. Since each tax cut is moderate or small, deficit exploding tax cuts never add up to big deficits that hurt our economic future. But if you combine everything, and I'm telling you where I'm cheating a little, and that is that I added a moderate fix for the alternative minimum tax, but I don't see how that's not possible, you've got a $4.6 trillion M&M. $4.6 trillion over a 10-year period is the cumulative cost of all of the tax cuts put together. Now, what does that mean for our future? This is another slide from my friend Peter Warzag. If you look at how much you need to save to fix Social Security, you need about a little less than 1% of GDP saved every year for 75 years. That's the line that says 0.73. When you add up all their tax cuts, it is 2.3 to 2.7. The size of their tax cuts, if extended over 75 years, are 3 times the amount of revenues you would need to completely make Social Security solvent, and enough to save both Medicare and Social Security. My next slide is just simply showing that even if you just freeze the top couple of rates in the estate tax, you could still close 53% of the gap. Now, is it worth it? On the distribution point, I don't think that distribution should itself be decisive, but I think when you see this type of distribution, you have to be a high burden of proof that this is absolutely going to be positive for the economy. I don't think the administration comes near meeting that. And my next statement shows that when you look at not just how much income tax people pay, but overall federal taxes, the top 1% do pay 28%. But when this tax cut is fully extended, they will get 44% of the tax cut. So while it is true that the top 1% pay enormous amount of the federal income tax, when you look at overall income, including Social Security and payroll, the number is lower, and the share of the tax cut they receive is far more dramatic. I'm going to skip all the way over to just make one point on spending, and then I will wrap up. Do surpluses cause a spending explosion? I hear the White House sometimes says, oh, if we save this money, it would go to spending. If you have surpluses, you're going to have huge spending. Okay, I've taken out the military budget. Nobody say anything to me about, oh, it's just the end of the Cold War. I'm just focusing on non-defense discretionary spending. Look at the 4 years that we had surpluses in our country. By the way, Bill Clinton's last 4 budgets. The average net spending as a percentage of GDP was 3.3, lower than the entire Bush-Reagan era, and lower than the 6 years when the Reagan controlled the White House and the Republicans controlled the Senate. I do not think that you can make this case. And I think that what we have fallen into is really a fundamental supply-side argument that tax cuts are always worth the cost to deficits, and that the only concern in fiscal discipline should be that of spending and keeping the size of government down. And as I will talk about as we go on, I think that there is a greater responsibility to savings for the future, for unknown contingencies, for war, for homeland security, and for fundamental economic growth and savings that require us to consider very strongly all the things that impact our fiscal future. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to actually let Professor Hubbard, I noticed in the M&M's issue, it is true that Mr. Hubbard looks like he is the one who has eaten less M&Ms than either three of us up here on the stage. But I'm going to try to ask you a question, but you can answer it and respond any way you want to, and then I would ask Gene a question. But you know, this is more of an intuitive issue, and going back to the spending issue, I mean, the President's asked for $80 billion or so for a war appropriation. The Congress is likely to augment that. Homeland security costs, a myriad of costs the Congress does not seem like cutting, agriculture program costs, a lot of other things. And the states are picking up enormous amount of costs that are being thrust upon them because of Homeland Security and other issues. And it just intuitively feels like this is a fiscal catastrophe made to order in terms of the major spending that's going to be forced on government coupled with the major tax cuts. And how do you reconcile that? Or, you know.
Well, on the issue of spending, I think there is a great deal of pressure on discretionary spending. Principally Homeland Security, but others, as you mentioned. But I don't think that's where the real fiscal danger is. One of the points I wanted to make in response to Gene, but I'll come back since you asked it, is it's quite amazing that while we have debates all over the country, as we should, on the tax cut, which would cost over 10 years, depending on whose estimate you look at, close to $700 billion, gross of any revenue effects. At the same time, both parties are looking at the addition of a prescription drug benefit to Medicare, which in present value terms would add as much debt as the entire stock of debt in the hands of the public today. While we are talking about the nickels and dimes, we are letting the 20s fly by it. And we can come back to that since both your question and Gene raised it. But if I might, in responding to Gene, a couple of points. One thing you didn't hear, and you don't hear in the debate in Washington, is an alternative affirmative vision for the president. In this situation, you have to do something or articulate the case for doing nothing, and there really isn't a viable alternative vision out there. The appropriate change or alternative change that's being considered in Washington is not, as Gene would describe it, of saving the tax cut. And here I don't mean to be partisan in criticism. This is a bipartisan criticism. The pressures are instead for spending. I don't see much viable case to be made in the real politic for saving at the moment. Three quick points I'd make in response to Gene's slides. It really reminded me of crisscrossing the country with Alan Blinder throwing up the slides. So I won't go through all the numbers with you, but I do want to make 3 points. One, about the issue of deficits don't matter. I bear some responsibility for coining Rubinomics, although I'll blame the Wall Street Journal editorial page for popularizing it. And what I meant by Rubinomics was not the notion that exogenous changes in government budget deficits don't affect interest rates. They do. And in fact, sales of my textbook went up as Democrats searched for quotes to the contrary, and I'm eternally grateful for that. But that's not what happened in the 90s. What happened in the 90s was largely extremely rapid economic growth relative to forecasts that increased all components of revenue, particularly revenue associated with the highest income individuals, exec compensation, the realization of capital gains, and so on. I might point out that, of course, interest rates are lower today than in the halcyon days that Gene described. That doesn't mean that deficits are or are not important, but means that many things determine interest rates in a capital market. I put my own math out there. It's in this year's economic report of the president, an exciting read. It's available on the web. You don't even have to buy it. And basically working out a simple model of global capital market and deficits, estimated that for every couple of $100 billion you might add to the stock of public debt, you might expect real interest rates to rise by between 1 and 3 basis points, not 1 and 3 interest rate points. The sign is right. It's very, very small. Second point I'd like to make is, what is the real deficit? You know, we focus a lot on the way the government defines deficits. As Gene correctly said, the real issue is in the entitlement programs. Social Security is something you talk about a lot. You may not know that the accumulated deficits in the Medicare program are even larger. The unfunded liabilities of Medicare are about 140% of GDP in the United States. Debt in the hands of the public is more like 35% of GDP. That is truly phenomenal off the pages here. And then third point I just wanted to make quickly on distribution. I'll give you two answers here. One I would call the Washington answer in response to Gene's, and then the other I'll give you is the economist answer, and I like economist answers better. But I'll start with the Washington answer. In Washington, what passes for the analysis of distribution is to do tables where you array people by current annual income and then look at the share of taxes they pay. Under that method, the president's tax cut is mildly progressive. Why is that? Because the attention that's being paid to dividends masks the fact that much of the dollars are in things like acceleration of a child credit, widening the bottom bracket of the individual income tax that appeal to low and moderate income families. But that's not the interesting answer. The interesting answer is, again, that who ultimately bears some of these taxes is the long run for all of us in our wages as a society. And we have to decide today, do we want to let short-term distribution tables hold us back from good long-term tax policy?
And Gene, I'm sure you may want to make some response to that, but I do have to repeat Glenn's question, which is a little bit, okay, we hear what's wrong with this thing. We got an economy that's, this is my characterization, it's very flat. And what is the Democrats' plan to get our economy moving again? And, or what do you think it should be? And does it involve raising taxes at all?
Well, I can answer your question and address a couple of things Glenn said at the same time. Glenn made the point, 2 points. He said, one, there's not a ton of appetite for savings in Washington, D.C. And secondly, he said that the Democrats are supporting, some Democrats are supporting prescription drugs that could run up to $800–900 billion a year, and questioned how good that was for fiscal discipline. And my response to that is that I think he's exactly hit the problem. But why is there not an appetite for savings and fiscal responsibility in Washington? I mean, just go back in the clock 3 years ago, the Republicans were willing to amend the Constitution to balance the budget. There was a competition in Washington about which party could pay down the debt fastest. We had a bipartisan compromise on fiscal discipline that was fundamentally upended by President Bush and their policy of never, ever holding themselves to any form of fiscal constraint on their priorities. So big surprise. When you break that bipartisan consensus on fiscal discipline, what you sometimes get is a good old-fashioned bidding war. But that's not what President Bush was left with. He inherited a very strong fiscal situation and a strong bipartisan compromise. So what should Democrats do? What should the president do right now? We should do a few things. We should have a grand compromise. So I'll give you a specific plan. Number one, we should be willing to pump more money into the economy as long as it is short-term and directed towards dealing with our economic weakness. Now, one thing you might do in that regard is give people short-term tax cuts that put money in their pockets now, but do not incur these long-term obligations. Secondly, you would try to help the states. There is so much distress at the states, so much cutting back, so much negative confidence, so much stories about tuition rising, cutbacks. You see virtually no effort from this administration to actually pump money into the states, even though they're being hit more on not only Medicaid costs or Medicaid burden, but as well Homeland Security costs. So I would be in favor of a combination of Democrat and Republican proposals that would stimulate the economy now, but would have only a short-term impact on the deficit. Then I would have the president call for a bipartisan compromise on fiscal discipline. And what the president would do is gain the moral authority to do that he has never had on fiscal discipline by being willing to put some of his own priorities on the table. The president could do that by simply asking to freeze the next round of tax cuts for the top couple of brackets and to not fully repeal the estate tax. And then he would ask the Democrats that as part of that agreement, they would hold the prescription drug costs down. They would not go for an $800 or $900 billion plan, because he would say to Democrats and Republicans and our country as a whole, our fiscal situation is turned. We haven't fixed Social Security and Medicare. We have a war on terrorism that could go on for years and years. We have potential conflict. This is a time where a great nation, though maybe willing to save money, to spend money to stimulate the economy now, is willing to show some constraint for our future. And I have Democrats pulling back on their top priority, the excessive cost of prescription drugs, and I am pulling back on part of my tax cut that only affects the people who are most able to do well in the society now. What would that do? It would stimulate the economy right now, and it would send a message to the world and to global investors that the era of fiscal discipline may perhaps make a comeback in the United States. And I think that would be better for confidence, and I think it would be better for bipartisanship and economic progress. So if you want a plan, that's a plan.
Okay, thank you. All right. What we're going to do now is we're going to go to questions, and I would ask the following. Please state your name, where you're from, whether you're at Harvard or where. Please make your questions with no longer than 30 seconds, or I'm going to cut you off because we have an awful lot of people here. And you can direct them to either person or ask both of the people to answer, and there are mics here, over here, and right here. So we'll start with this gentleman here.
Hi. Thank you both for coming. My name is Mark Ricks. I'm a student at the business school, and I'm also a section leader in Professor Feldstein's Introductory Economics class, Ec 10. Tomorrow at noon, I'll have 24 students in front of me, and I want to give them a brief synopsis of this debate. I'd like to be able to point them to a couple of concepts in introductory micro or macroeconomics that they can think of as sort of emblematic of the point of view of each side. I'd just be curious as to which part of the typical economics curriculum that each of you thinks I should point them to, because when you spend a year telling them that there are truths in economics and then smart, educated, experienced people like yourselves disagree, it's frustrating for them to try to reconcile those two sides.
So let's hear some quick truths.
Well, I mean, I think a quick truth that's associated with the president's plan is the emphasis on long-term incentives and the dynamics of an economy. You know, Gene talked a little bit at the end about short-term, focusing a plan on the short term. Virtually no evidence of which I'm aware would suggest that short-term temporary tax cuts have much of an effect on the economy, and that's probably a very useful point to make in Ec 10.
Gene?
I would tell them that the laws of supply and demand are not repealed for capital just because tax cuts are at stake. And when you when you reduce the supply of capital, by running excessive deficits, there will be less capital, and prices will go up, meeting interest rates. And the reason I had all those boring quotes up there was because I was trying to show the degree that this was mainstream economics, that people like Paul Volcker and Alan Greenspan and Lehman Brothers and Goldman Sachs all attributed significant falls in interest rate and investment and part of the productivity boon of the 90s to the turnaround in our fiscal situation.
Let's see. Andy?
Hi, my name is Andy Frank. I'm a sophomore at the college. This question is for both of you. One of the issues that has been around there that I don't think really came up was that this is sort of, this recession was going to happen anyways, that it was, partly from the bubble that it occurred. How much would each of you attribute the events, the fiscal policy of the Bush administration, either to help get us out of it, or the policy has hurt us in the short run and the long run? How much has the Bush administration actually affected the fiscal solvency of the United States?
Gene, why don't you take that first this time?
Well, I don't think there's any question that we had a fundamental excesses, that the laws of, the laws of business cycle and the laws of human nature were not repealed. There's no question people overshot in their capacity, overshot in their estimates, and there was going to be a slowdown of some form. So I don't think one can blame President Bush, and truthfully, I don't know if you could blame any politician for that type of fundamental, I think, human nature that happens in the business cycle. I guess where I would blame them is that I do not think that they have done the things that were most critical for confidence, which is, one, getting a very, very quick stimulus. Their stimulus came, you know, they brag about the little stimulus they did, but they could have gotten something quickly and bipartisan early on if it hadn't been linked to their longer-term tax cut. Second, while I do think Glenn did performed well for his views there, I do think the economic team as a whole did not portray the time of unity and confidence that was comforting at a time like that. And three, I really do think people judge the United States a bit by how well we have our fiscal house in order, as we somewhat judge Japan and China by their degree of financial and bank reform, or Europe to the degree of their labor market rigidities. And so I do think that this overall hurt confidence. I think their tax cut helped a little. I think interest rates, as low as they are, were still a little higher because of the deterioration. So I think most of the help we got was from the 475 basis point cut that Alan Greenspan did, low energy prices, and the degree of refinancing that went on. But my biggest concern, as I've tried to speak, is much more about what their policies mean to our long-term fiscal and economic future.
Glenn?
Yeah, I certainly don't disagree with part of what Gene just said, which is the role monetary policy played. You know, we had a very aggressive monetary easing because I think the Federal Reserve realized correctly this was not a typical cycle, and the refinancing and the housing channels, I think, were extremely important. I would also credit the president's tax cut, and here I would put part of this in luck. Again, I don't think you can fine-tune the economy. The timing of the receipt of the first tranche of the tax cut turned out to be very fortuitous. I think it's, in all fairness, one has to call it that. But I think that to do more stimulus up front, not connected to long-term tax cuts, wouldn't have had much in effect. I think people spend out of the president's tax cut because it is associated with a long-term tax cut.
Professor Franken?
Okay, a couple things. During Bush 1 and Bush 2, I guess this is from Mr. Hubbard, the 6 years, over 6 years, there have been no new jobs created, no new net jobs. So this is just an observation, really. If you project that out, if the Bushes had run the country from the beginning of the country to now, no one in this country ever would have worked. And I think I'd add to Gene that part of what hurt the economy was that the response to what you said was the lack of confidence people had in companies like Enron, and because of all that mess, that the Bush response to that was very weak, and that they had appointed Harvey Pitt, and then were very slow to get rid of him, et cetera. Now, my question is, in one of the debates, President Bush said this. He said, by far, a vast majority of my tax cut goes to those at the bottom. By far, a vast majority of my tax cut goes to those at the bottom. What could he possibly have meant by that?
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Franken is affiliated with Harvard University. I want you to, he's
a fellow at the Shorenstein Center, sir.
Okay.
Let me try to go through the 3 parts, I think, of your question. On the no new jobs, since I was in the first Bush administration too, maybe it's my fault. Don't blame the,
Okay.
don't blame the Bushes. The serious answer to your question is that for an economy to create jobs, we've got to grow faster than potential. And everybody talks a lot about the miracle of the high potential growth in the economy, and it truly is wonderful for all of us. But it also means that demand has to grow well into the threes for a sustained period of time to have job creation. And that's precisely what the president is trying to do. I think he is much more aggressive, perhaps, than the first Bush administration. On Enron, I beg to differ. If you line check Sarbanes-Oxley versus the president's 10-point plan, you'll find all 10 points. So, and the president was about 6 months ahead of that. And if you've watched the president viscerally, I would say that many of his economic advisors, including me, had to hold him back, not push him forward. So I think this is somebody who is extremely concerned about accountability.
And the other question was jobs.
The one really question I had was, by far, the vast majority of my tax cut goes to those at the bottom, by far.
All right.
The vast majority
I
of my
don't think
tax
I was
goes
with
to those
him
at
when
the-
he said that. I'm not sure.
He said that in a debate in South Carolina. He was debating Senator McCain.
Oh, during the
During the campaign is what
During
during
the
the
campaign,
campaign, okay.
yeah.
Okay,
He said
all
by
right.
far a vast majority of my tax.
Thank you, Mr. Franken. Thank you. All right.
But what could he have meant by that?
It is, no, seriously, it is true that for that tax cut, a very large share did go to low and moderate income families. The high income families got a smaller share of the Bush tax cut
You're talking about the
than their
first
share of, the first tax
tax
cut, than their share of taxes paid. I'm guessing that's what the president's
But
referring
was
to.
it by far a vast majority
Thank you.
going
Thank
to
you.
those at the bottom?
I give the president great
It wasn't,
license.
I don't think, in any definition of any of
No.
those words.
Thank you, sir.
Al was not actually particularly, I have to fact check you on one thing. Actually, the two Bush administrations together are negative 900,000 jobs. So I don't know how that works into the joke. But can I say something? Let me actually say something say something kind of serious about this issue on distribution. There are kind of two different, this does go to, I think, a very philosophical way of people look at things. I think, and this is not meant to be a partisan comment, I think that some people say you should look at how much people pay. And if you're giving a tax cut, you should give the biggest percentage to the people who pay that percentage. Now, I have tried to show that I thought they even got a larger amount, but the truth is, I wouldn't be happy had they gotten just exactly their amount. Because I look at it much more from a resource side. I look and say, if you have $2 trillion, how can this country, and the economy's going fair, has had a strong decade, how can that resources, how should we best allocate it among the different challenges we have? Certainly one of those challenges could be people's tax burdens, but the other challenges are Social Security, Medicare, our child poverty rate. And when you look at it from that perspective, it does seem to me virtually obscene that we have taken this dramatic amount of our resources and given it to people who I'm now happy to say, like myself, because now for the first time I can talk about being in the top 1%. And I think the notion that it fundamentally affects your work effort or fundamentally is coming to you at a time of need and is going to lead to the growth in the economy is just not well-founded. And I think there are so many challenges we have, and certainly our long-term fiscal situation for Social Security and Medicare is certainly one of them that should have taken priority over tax cuts, over so much resources being returned to such a small sliver of America.
Mr. Hubbard?
I think that's a phony debate. I don't think this is a debate over moral philosophy or social justice. I think it's a debate over economics. And I think there are two very distinct views, one of which I would argue is better supported by the evidence. One view is that tax policy is largely lump sum. That's Gene's description. We can move money around various people and choose whatever income distribution we want. Unfortunately, that's not borne out by economic theory. Unfortunately, it's not borne out by facts. Most people who become wealthy in this country not by saving their way there, but by creating businesses, by being entrepreneurs, by taking risks. All the evidence we have is that very high marginal tax rates discourage those activities. Ladies and gentlemen, there's no such thing as a free lunch. That's the one real truism of economics. And when you say, let's just tax these productive activities and redistribute the money, that comes at a very great social cost.
Bill. Okay.
My name is Bill McCamley, and I'm a second-year public policy student here at the Kennedy School. I'll be running for local office in my home state of New Mexico in the next election cycle. I don't know if going to Harvard is going to help or hurt that, but I had a question for you guys that was sort of touched upon. Now, if I win, I'll be getting involved in a state and local set of governments that have been under some of the hardest financial times that people can remember since World War II. For instance, in my state, under a Democratic governor, Bill Richardson, each school district was asked to cut their budgets by 5%. How will this tax cut, and some of it is obviously going to go through for a while, affect the current fiscal situations that state and local governments are having to deal with now?
Well, I think it's important to look at where this came from. Actually, your governor has referred to me as the Iceman for the answer I'm about to give you, so I'll give you that as a warning. But states largely are in a fiscal crisis of their own making, and I say this lovingly. The notion that temporary aid from the federal government reverses state crises is far-fetched. The states that are in the biggest trouble are the ones who increased spending dramatically during the 90s, and we all know how state finances work. Now, the question for the tax cut is, what's the effect of the tax cut? And here the answer has got a couple of channels. Faster economic growth is good for the states in the same way it is for the federal government. And when I was at the council, we estimated that states collectively would gain about $6 billion annually in federal revenue, revenue for the states. If you indeed took dividends out of the tax base, many states, as you know, piggyback on the federal structure, that would subtract about $4 billion from state revenues. Call it +2, call it a wash. Either way, the tax cut is not really the issue facing the states. The issue is facing up to their problems. Now, there are federal roles here. They don't have much to do with the tax cut, but the federal government hasn't done its ultimate job in unfunded mandates, in education, for homeland security, and there is a legitimate question. But I disagree with the notion that temporary aid to the states does anything but boost state spending even more.
Do you want to respond to this or not?
Yeah, I mean, well, I agree with his numbers on the on dividend, but this is a straight-up resource allocation. I mean, this is one thing we will continue to agree on. This is absolutely a philosophical debate. We have a certain amount of resources, and there's been a very conscious effort made to divert those back to a very small sliver of people, even while that type of pain is going along. Now, Glenn is right about one thing. You could have a moral hazard problem with states. If you bail states out all the time, then they might act like the Bush administration does and never save for a rainy day again. So I think, you know, it wouldn't make sense to completely bail them out, but a certain amount of relief at a time of contraction to not have this negative economic news actually reducing economic activity and hurting economic confidence, which is lower today than it was the day after 9/11 would be important. And Glenn keeps going back to growth. You know, there's a book about Czechoslovakia where it starts where they talk about them kind of whiting out in the 60s, things they didn't like. If you're looking for a growth industry, anybody here, I'll give you a growth industry. It will be the amount of conservative think tanks that will try to white out the 90s economically. They will try to pretend as if it didn't happen. Glenn talks about what do we need to do for economic growth. The rise in productivity growth that we're seeing in our country, the strongest economic performance, the greatest job period, one of the most tremendous periods of competition and investment in our country, happened under an environment of a bipartisan commitment to fiscal discipline that had a dramatic impact on expectations, on increasing savings, and I think up the confidence in long-term growth. So this is not about whether we're for growth. This is fundamentally very different views about philosophies and policies that create economic growth. And I'd say my decade, our decade, is a little stronger than theirs right now.
One rejoinder right here.
Just two quick points. One, I can't resist this last one. You know, it is very common in Washington to think the economy's performance revolves around events in Washington. The truth of the long boom of the 90s has to do with the energy of the private sector. The story Gene told is exactly what I've described as Rubinomics. And there is a discussion of that again in the economic report of the president, if anyone's interested. But the point I wanted to come back to is Gene has emphasized a couple times about slivers of society getting a benefit of the tax cut. You know, Gene is not the only person experiencing upward or downward mobility in our country. And in fact, all of you, those of you at least who are students, I strongly suspect, I hope and pray, are going to have upward mobility in the income distribution. It is a big mistake to look at the static income distribution as if that's where you are in society. It's not only a mistake from your introspection, it's a mistake from the numbers. And if you look at panels of taxpayers over time, you find very large mobility. So the notion that this is somehow a tax cut or a tax increase for one person over a lifetime just isn't the facts.
Glenn, what percentage of Americans?
Wait, I'm sorry, we got to go. These students.
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
My name is Jack Guerrero. I'm an MBA student at the Harvard Business School. I'd like to direct my question to the former advisor to the Clinton administration. You give the Clinton balanced budgets a lot of credit for lowering interest rates and creating an overall favorable environment for the private sector. But there are two levers involved when we talk about public spending. One is tax revenue, and the other is public borrowings. Each of these displaces available funds from the private sector. So would you not agree that, that during the Clinton years, the private sector would have been better off if we would have had less total public expenditure, even if some of it would have been financed through deficit spending?
I got to tell you, I'm not sure I understand your question. The degree that through a mixture of spending and public and revenue policies, there was less borrowing. And let me say something just so we are clear on one thing. I agree with Glenn on one thing, which is it is very easy to give presidents too much credit or too much blame for what goes on in the economy. Presidential policy, federal policy is a role. It plays a piece. There are many things that happen, but there's no question that the decision to save surpluses when they were created, and there's no question that the decision on fiscal policy played a piece. And maybe I should have taken all my time reading the quotes, because this always ends up being, like as if you're Bill Clinton's economic advisor saying this. Alan Greenspan, Paul Volcker, the overwhelming number of objective people absolutely feel that the deficit reduction in 93, the saving the surpluses in 98, 99, the 1997 bipartisan balanced budget agreement were a contributing part in reducing the amount that we were borrowing from the federal government. Some of that was from spending. There were significant Medicare savings in 97. There were savings in 93. Some of it was from raising taxes on the top 1.2% of Americans. And some of it was the policy of simply not having these kind of large spending or tax cut programs when surpluses evolved. But the case was the government was borrowing less, crowding out less, there was more capital available, and that helped keep interest rates low, even at a time when there was a boom for an investment in housing.
Right, this gentleman here, and then I'll get to you. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion.
Your name and
my name is Ben Wickler. I'm a senior at the college, economics concentrator. There's been a lot of discussion of growth and also of distribution. So my question's about that. I think everyone likes growth, but there are different types of growth. Like in the 50s and 60s, there was broad-based growth going to every sector of society, and again in the late 90s, people at the bottom did better, people at the top did better. In the 80s, real incomes for people in the bottom actually went down while they went up sharply at the top. And for a lot of the 90s, they continued to rise much more quickly at the top than in the middle. So my question is, what do you and President Bush prefer, the bottom and top both going up or like this? And also generally, I think most people are against inequality. So what's the president's heretofore secret plan to reduce inequality in America? Thank you.
Well, I think on the question of growth, there's no question that the president and his administration are very supportive of and trying to encourage policies that raise growth for everyone. Things that get our economy growing together, get productivity growth growing, are the key to raising economic growth. It's a time-honored thing. When President Kennedy said a rising tide lifts all boats, he was absolutely right. So that's the president's objective. I don't know that the president has a secret plan for ending inequality. I'll put my own bias. I won't attribute it to the president. I care a great deal about poverty. I care very little about inequality.
President Kennedy's tide did seem to lift all the boats, but some of the other tides didn't as much. It seems like a
Well, you'll notice that what President Kennedy proposed were very large cuts in marginal tax rates and investment incentives. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah, from 90.
Okay. Rod?
Good evening. I'm Rod O'Connor. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. It was noted during the campaign that President Bush was the first president to have an MBA coming into office, notably from this university, which should give him an edge on understanding the economic conditions in this country. But the turnover, for various reasons, in his economic team has been fairly dramatic in the first couple of years of this administration, and the economy is still struggling. By contrast, numerous people in the economic community, not necessarily political people, complimented Secretary Rubin, Secretary Summers, the current president of this university, and even Vice President Gore and President Clinton for their understanding of the economy. I'm wondering what assurance you could give us now that we have the right people in charge to manage this time of economic distress.
Well, of course, the person who's the captain of any administration economic team, whether it's this one or any other, is the president himself. And the president has been the principal steward of economic policy. The president's individual members of his economic team have individual records, and I'll let you judge them for yourselves on M&M consumption or lack thereof or any other attribute of them. But I think overall the president has gotten very good economic advice, and indeed the advice that he has acted on.
Gene, you want to comment? Or?
Well, this is always a tough issue because I do have an respect for virtually all the people who have served him, Larry Lindsay, Paul O'Neill, Glenn. They're all very capable and all have had very distinguished careers. I do think that one thing they could have borrowed from our administration a bit better was that while they continued the idea of a National Economic Council, I don't think that they were always the whole is as strong as the parts, and I think there was a sense of often conflicting views. That will happen sometimes on any administration, but I do think there was less confidence in the economic team as a whole and how they functioned, even though I think all the individual members were very highly credentialed and well respected.
We're going to close right now, and I've agreed to give each gentleman a couple minutes to summarize or say anything they want to say, and so I'm going to begin with Gene.
Well, as I think I've said a few times, I really do think this is about fundamentally different visions of how to create economic growth and how to, as Glenn said, have growth that raises everybody's living standards. I, like him, care most that we are raising everybody's living standards and how much we are. Then I worry about whether people in the top are doing well per se. It's more important that everybody is being lifted up. I find the turn from the bipartisan consensus we had on fiscal discipline to be very disturbing. There was a point here where I may have seemed like I was attributing too much to federal policy or President Clinton, but there's a reason for doing that. You had a strategy that by all purposes was working very well. It was not just a Democratic strategy. In fact, until 2001 came, Republicans simply wanted to share in the success. They wanted to simply point out that they had worked with Bill Clinton on the 1997 Balanced Budget Agreement and that they should get credit as well for that bipartisan fiscal discipline. And I think for people like John Kasich and Pete Domenici, there is a degree of credit there. But this departure that we've seen would make you think that the 90s were a period of economic desolation, that nothing was going well. And after all the work that this country did, all the politically painful choices that the first President Bush made that may have cost him his job, all the painful political choices that Bill Clinton made, all the painful political choices that Newt Gingrich and his team were willing to make, all of them recognizing that the federal deficit and our saving for the future did matter for interest rate savings for our future, and that we were putting ourselves on path of long-term fiscal discipline. This administration has come in and blown up that consensus. They have returned Washington to a fundamental bidding war where they never ask, how much does a tax cut cost? Should it be offset? Should dividends be paid for with closing corporate loopholes? None of those things are done. And you can put the green eye shade away for a second and just say this is fundamentally about responsibility. With war and recession, with war and terrorism, we have learned, I have learned even more, why it's important to save for a rainy day. Why it really matters to be fiscally conservative. Things do go wrong, and our country responded with strength because we had built up surpluses to get us through this time. And we had resources that could have put us in a position for Social Security reform, whether you like the individual accounts that Glenn's proposed, or you don't, or you like the kind of individual accounts outside of Social Security that we propose with USA accounts, or whatever your Social Security reform is. There were resources for transition that could have led to this important reform. There were resources that, if not leading to a spending boom, but moderately used, could have helped us address some of our major challenges. And instead, we are now facing, again, one of the worst fiscal situations, and the leadership says to us, there is no need for mutual sacrifice. There is no need for even the most well-off Americans, not only to maybe freeze the tax cuts they're about to get, but they have to have them accelerated, and dividend cuts as well. Even at a time when we should be pulling together, not just for the short-term crisis we face, but for our long-term sense of generational responsibility so that we can truly say we're investing in our children, not borrowing from their future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me begin actually where Gene left off. An extremely important part of thinking about economic policy in this country or any other is our children. It is the long term. The president, as a leader, has to play the hand he's dealt. He has responded with an economic policy that is aimed very squarely at the short-term risks the economy faces and is very much consistent with this administration's view, at least, of what good long-term economic policy is. You've heard tonight two very different versions of what makes an economy work. One is that budget changes in Washington work through interest rates and investment to affect economic growth. Another is that the resiliency of the private sector is principally responsible for economic growth. I think the evidence is pretty clear on which of those visions is there. We are at a time when it is very important to think about our nation's future fiscal capacity. And to do that, we need to do three things. One is to get the economy growing again, and that is what the president is trying to do. Two is to show restraint in observed spending, discretionary spending, wherever we can. And three, most important and least talked about, a fundamental analysis of, examination of, and discipline of our entitlement programs, which are the real danger, I'm afraid, we all face. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's a mark of a great forum that we've had an opportunity to hear the two thoughtful speakers with two different perspectives, but respectful and yet disagreeing substantively and intelligently. So on behalf of the Institute of Politics, we thank you both for coming here tonight.
Thank you.